In his new book, India's Power Elite, Class, Caste and Cultural Revolution, the well-known Indian author, economist and commentator Dr. Sanjaya Baru dwells on the three pillars of what constitutes that power elite: upper caste, wealth and the English language. While the first of the three is an obvious reality, what is often not fully recognized are the other two, wealth and the English language. That was the dominating triumvirate for decades after India's independence. That equation began to change in the late 1970s and the early 80s, but it has picked up a dramatic momentum only in the last decade or so since the rise of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and what could be termed as the rise of the subaltern. There is the making of a new power elite in India which no longer speaks the language and idiom that dominated it for so long. Mayank Chhaya report spoke to Dr. Baru, a former advisor to former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, on how he sees the shifting equation in India's larger political and cultural reality. Dr. Sanjaya Baru.
Thank you for your always expeditious response. I know you don't have any particular reason to interact, but I'm grateful for that. And congratulations.
Well, I'm a retired person, writer, sitting at home thanks to COVID, so one has the time.
And congratulations on your book, India's Power Elite, Class, Caste, and Cultural Revolution.
Thank you.
You've said that the book was, in a sense, triggered by the American sociologist C. Charles Wright Mill's 1956 book, The
That's right.
Power Elite. His central theme was that the ordinary American citizen is helpless in the face of a political, corporate, and military power elite, while the latter, that is the power elite, is not particularly aware of its own standing in terms of its own consequence for the society at large. What is your central thesis?
Well, first of all, my central thesis is that just as Wright Mills described for the United States, and this would be for most countries, I don't think it's peculiar to the US, we are all unequal societies in which an elite wields power and different forms of power. There is economic power, there is political power, there is cultural power. Power takes many forms, and I discuss that in my book. And Mills argued that in post-war America, he identified the groups that he regarded as those in control of power. Two fundamental differences between what Mills described as the US situation and what I describe as the Indian situation is that he gave a lot of importance to the power of the military in the United States. Partly because after the Second World War, with the US victory, the military emerged as a very popular and powerful institution. You had a former general as president of the United States. And also partly because during the interwar period and after the war, the military industry complex emerged as a major powerful business institution because the United States got into manufacturing defense equipment. Now, in the Indian case, we still don't have a defense industrial complex. We are beginning to have. In fact, this morning's papers announced that the government is increasing the scope of domestically manufactured armaments. So in due time, we will have a military, an industrial complex with a military dimension. But the armed forces have never been politically important till recently. I mentioned some exceptions, but by and large in India, they've been kept outside of the political system. The second difference, which is of course more fundamental and more central to my argument, is the entire institution of caste. Mills looks at the United States, American society in purely class terms. There are the rich, there are the poor, there are the middle class. But in India, class is only one dimension of inequality or differentiation. Caste is an extremely important dimension. And so my book is in fact titled The Power Elite, Caste, Class, and a Cultural Revolution.
Right. I heard you quoted Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia to offer three defining features of the Indian power elite. One, you mentioned upper caste. than wealth and the English language, which is a rather interesting combination. I don't think that may exist elsewhere in terms of wealth and the English language. How much of that dynamic has changed since the rise of Prime Minister Modi, especially because he was seen as someone spearheading the rise of the subaltern?
Well, I mean, that is central to my book. I, in fact, found Ramanor Loya's description of the Indian power elite in terms of these three criterion: wealth, inherited wealth, upper caste status, and the control or the access to the English language as the three elements. And he was writing in the late 50s. Now, the transition away from that has happened in the intervening 3-4 decades, not just because of Prime Minister Modi, but go back into the 1970s, 80s. Inherited wealth is still important in India, but we now have a large number of people who are first generation wealthy. Those who come out of agriculture, those who are into manufacturing, in the IT sector, for example. I mean, the classic example being, the Infosys founders, who are well known in the United States. So we have now wealth in the first generation. It's not just inherited wealth. Upper caste is no longer politically important, and that change happened in the 1980s with the rise of the what in India are called OBCs, other backward classes, the middle caste. And Mulayam Singh Yadav in UP, Lalu in Bihar, N.T. Ramarao in Andhra Pradesh. Many of these groups were essentially from the middle caste. And the significance about Mr. Modi is that he is the first really important political leader at the national level who comes from the middle caste. I mean, we had briefly Deve Gowda, who was a prime minister for about a year, who was a backward caste person. But otherwise, most of our prime ministers, and again, with the exception of Manmohan Singh, was a Sardarji, was a Sikh, from Nehru to Vajpayee to Narasimha Rao, all Brahmins, upper caste, essentially. And VP Singh also upper caste. Modi is the first backward caste prime minister who came on a popular vote. So the caste factor. The third element is the English language. Now, interesting thing about the English language is it is no longer a passport to power in large parts of India. It is still a passport to wealth in the sense that, knowledge of the English language, you get better jobs, you get to go abroad, etc., etc. So, the cultural elite in India still operate in the English language. But the political elite, and this happened across the country, but in Modi's time, we see it happening at the national level, that Hindi becomes the language of government much more in the recent past.
What do you think has led to the shift? And while you are at it, I'm curious personally, why is it that as a country and as a civilization, we still remain so mired in such clearly egregious nomenclature as upper caste and backward caste and other backward caste? And I haven't understood since my teenage. I'm 60 now. I still don't get this obsession with this nomenclature.
Well, it's not typical to India. Caste, first of all, has various forms. And in different societies, there are different ways of social differentiation. I mean, in the United States, you have white Americans, then among the whites, you have WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the Catholic, then you have the Jews and black, and American political analysis is all about the black vote, the Afro-American vote, the Asian American vote. So social differentiation is there in all societies. I think the interesting, and incidentally, white, black, etc. have the same feature as caste because these are inherited by birth. You cannot be born a white and become black, or you cannot be born black and become white. So you cannot be born, a Dalit and become Brahmin, or you cannot be born a Brahmin and become a Reddy or a Jat. Your birth gives you your caste identity, just as your birth gives you your race identity. The difference between Hinduism and other religions of the book is that in other religions, conversion is possible. So you need not be born a Muslim to become a Muslim. You can be converted, or you don't have to be born a Christian to be to become a Christian, but you have to be born a Hindu to remain a Hindu. You cannot be converted into Hinduism. So, those are the kind of peculiarities of India. But the idea that society is divided into groups and unequal groups. I mean, it's not as if, these are simply kind of vertical divisions, horizontal divisions. They are also a kind of pyramidal structure of wealth and power that identifies. So if you are upper caste, you tend to be wealthier. If you are, Dalit, if you tend to be less wealthy, though all these things are also changing as wealth becomes more diversified.
I'm glad you mentioned the diversification of wealth. That's one aspect. The second aspect, as you point out, is the sort of distinct diminishment of the English language as a tool of power. Do you think that shift is here to stay?
In politics, yes. Not yet in business, not in the cultural sphere or what we might call the education sphere. In fact, one of the curious things that is happening in India, and I refer to it in my book, is the increasing demand from the Dalits, the bottom of the kind of caste pyramid, for access to English education. There is a famous Dalit ideologue called Kancha Ailaya, who has actually written a book demanding his argument is, if the upper castes have access to the global markets and educational and employment opportunities around the world because they know the English language, why should we be educated in our in a vernacular, in an Indian language? We also should be educated in the English language. And more governments across the country are actually reintroducing the teaching of English because of this demand.
Right. One of the most troublesome and perhaps unintended consequences of the shift that you're talking about has been sort of the brewing up of the disdain for domain expertise and intellectual rigor, which has become part of both the statecraft as well as political craft under the current dispensation. People flaunt their ignorance now. At the very least, they confuse having an opinion with possessing knowledge. Where do you think that is leading India to? You see consequences all around of being happily ignorant.
Yes, indeed. I'm glad you make this point because it's an important part of my argument. In fact, the title of my book is The Power Elite, Class, Caste, and a Cultural Revolution. And I deliberately use the metaphor of the Cultural Revolution to draw a parallel between what was happening in China during the mid-60s when academicians, scientists, professors, the intellectuals were all sent off to villages to plow fields, and they were kind of looked down upon. And you had to be a communist ideologue to remain in Beijing, and that kind of anti-intellectualism that we associate with the Chinese Cultural Revolution is something that I find worrisomely something I find with the current dispensation led by the BJP. It's not the only party that is anti-intellectual. There's a lot of anti-intellectualism in many political parties across the country. And that is worrisome. And I think, that has had a impact on the quality of government and the quality of governance. I mean, you take, for example, even the permanent civil service, the IAS, the IPS, it attracted the best and the brightest 50 years ago, 40 years ago, even 30 years ago. But the quality of people coming into these services is going down because there are other professions. Quite naturally, people go into the private sector, or they go abroad, or they go into engineering, medicine, finance, banking. Don't want to come into government because government doesn't pay much. And therefore, there is a decline in the quality of people in government. But I think more than that, this anti-intellectualism, because of which politicians think that they know it all. I mean, everything is justified often by governments on the grounds that the minister in charge wants this done. As if the minister's wisdom is the last word. And so we keep being told the Prime Minister wants this done. Even if all the architects in Delhi and around the country and the world have been criticizing what is called the Central Vista project, we are told the government wants it done. So the government is the only repository of all wisdom. And I think that is a dangerous trend, that you devalue the views of experts, you devalue the views of professionals, and that is not going to keep India in good state.
Do you think there is a limit to reaping the political benefits of this approach that the Modi uh, idea seems to have done for the last 7 years? Is there a limit to how much you can milk this, or you think this can go on for a while?
Well, it could go on for a while depending on how well the economy does. I mean, of course, I'm a trained economist, and I have always believed that each one of us as individuals, what we look for in life is economic security, job security for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren. And as long as the economy is doing well, I think a lot of wrong policies can be pursued quite easily. It's happened in the past, it can happen again. But right now, the Indian economy is in a very bad shape. So I think it's a good question, but I'm not yet clear what the answer is, because even in 2019, Modi won that election partly because of the whole wave of nationalism stirred by the Pulwama terrorist attack and cross-border attack on Pakistan. So we use this latent anti-Pakistan, anti-Muslim sentiment to whip up support, because the economy had already started functioning badly. I mean, the decline in the performance of the economy precedes COVID, and the COVID has only made it worse.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned that, because again, I read some figures that between January 1st and March 31st, 2020, the GDP was about 3.1% in that quarter on an annual basis, which ironically, as I think even Dr. Swami pointed out, is the Hindu rate of growth in an avowedly Hindu dispensation. Where do you think, with that as a backdrop, what is the way out? And India is in the midst of a horrific pandemic. There is an all-round economic mismanagement, as you have pointed out frequently. Where are we headed now?
Well, we are in a low-level equilibrium at the moment. I mean, if you look at the long period from 1950 onwards, from 1950 to 80, we had this 3.5% growth, which was called by Raj Krishna, an economist, as the Hindu rate of growth. But the reason he called it the Hindu rate of growth was not to disparage Hinduism, as Mr. Swami thinks. But actually, the reason he called it the Hindu rate of growth is that the argument was that, this is a rate of growth that does not destabilize society. Because the kind of Hindu attitude is, so as long as you're better off today, you're better off than yesterday, you live with it. We were not an ambitious society seeking higher rates of growth. But that phase ended. From 1980 to 2000, we had 5.5% growth rate. And from 2000 to 2015, we have had 7.5% growth. So actually, we've been on a rising growth curve, and that is the basis on which people have talked about a rising India, even in the United States. I mean, people like President Bush, Condoleezza Rice, at the turn of the century, they were all drawing attention to the fact that India was now catching up with China. But since 2015, the decline has begun, and today nobody looks at India as catching up with China. China is now 5 times bigger than India. And the idea that somehow we were catching up with China is now regarded, it's not on the table at the moment.
Right. Within India's stifling fiscal constraints, are there any lessons to be learned from the Biden administration's massive stimulus package, which put money directly into the hands of Americans? And this, I mean, as a strategy that you've talked about to boost demand rather than just the supply.
Yes, I think more and more economists have been arguing in favor of a fiscal stimulus, putting money into the hands of people, particularly the poorer sections of society, the unemployed, the young, and in the hope that they will consume more, boost demand, boost the economic growth. And a lot of people are puzzled as to why the government is not yet doing it. The government has its own argument. They think they've done what was needed this year, that they will do more when it is needed, etc. Well, I have my own personal theory on this. I think, Narendra Modi is the kind of politician who wouldn't waste his money prematurely. There are no elections due this year. We are now only in June. For the rest of the next 6 months, he doesn't have to go and ask for votes. He has to win a lot of elections next year, particularly in his own home state of Gujarat and in the state from which he got elected, UP. Both are due in 2022. So my guess would be that in the run-up to those elections, he will start dumping money into the economy and stimulating demand and making feel everybody that COVID is behind us. There's a lot of purchasing power. Economy is rising. This is my theory. I may be proved wrong. I'm willing to be proved wrong. But as of now, that's the only rational explanation, because I think most professional economists think the government should be spending money even today.
Right. But on the other hand, if he were to dump a lot of cash in people's hands right now, and you have another 3 years before 2024, and that could push the economy in the direction that we all wanted to go. So can he not do it now and then take advantage of that success in 2024?
No, memories are very short. I mean, I think it is Prime Minister Harold Wilson who said famously that 1 week is a long time in politics. 3 years is infinity. So people are not going to remember what he did in 2021, 22 when they go to vote in 2024. And he needs to have enough firepower, fiscal firepower, to be able to do whatever is needed closer to the next election.
Another point that you've made frequently is about the fiscal planning, budgeting, for instance. People do not look at the psychological or emotional aspects of budgeting in terms of expectations. Why do you think that aspect is missing in the budgeting exercise, that people need to feel good about what is coming? It's never looked at seriously. I don't think any other government has done it consciously in India.
No, I think this is the key. I mean, it's not just about budgeting. It's about overall approach to economic policy. I think the fact is that at the moment in India, expectations about the future are very low. People do not expect the next 6 months to be better than the last 6 months. So there is a lot of risk aversion. Even if you put money into the hands of people, it's likely that they may not spend immediately because they are not sure whether they will get a job, or the children will get a job, or whether the tuition fees will go up, or whether you want to save your money to send your kid abroad, etc., etc. So there's a lot of risk aversion and uncertainty because expectations are low. And this is one of the fundamental laws in economics, that expectations determine outcomes. If you think next year is going to be better than this year, you take actions in such a way that next year is better than this year. We've seen this in the past. It's not correct to say that former governments did not understand this. In fact, the one person who understood this very well was Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was a Keynesian. What is surprising to me about this government is that they don't seem to, first of all, recognize the role of expectations, because they are not formed with speeches. I mean, it's not enough if the Prime Minister says tomorrow will be better than today, or if the Chief Economic Advisor says it. You need to pursue a kind of range of policies, social policies, political policies, economic policies, which give confidence to people that here is a government that knows what the problem is. Here is a government that has highly talented people in it. Here is a government that is ready to and therefore, things will get better. Unfortunately, that optimism is lacking,
right?
Because the experience of the last 3-4 years is that we seem to have a government without adequate expertise. A lot of mistakes being made, even in the vaccination program, for instance, a lot of incompetence in the way it's done, in maintenance of law and order, a lot of incompetence. So incompetence is something that creates a lot of uncertainty.
Right. Another point I've not personally understood is this rather persistent reluctance on the part of governments around the world, not just in India, to print massive amounts of money at the time of such crises. Why is there so much sanctity attached to this idea? Just print some more money and distribute it. What's the problem there?
This is the problem. And the problem is that there is risk aversion on the part of the fiscal authorities because inflation can go up. I mean, even in the West now, you refer to Biden's fiscal strategy. If you read the latest issue of The Economist, already there is concern that that might stimulate inflation, except that in the West, the rate of inflation in the last several years has been as low as 2%. So even a
Right.
doubling of that, going to 4%, in my judgment at least, is not a big deal. But in India, inflation has been an average of about 4%. Now it's much higher, 6%. And nobody wants the rate of inflation to go very much above that.
Right.
And so the fear with injecting too much cash is that it will stimulate too much inflation. Now, on this, there are economists have different views. My own view is that we can live with 6% inflation. I don't see a problem with 6% inflation. Anything below 6%, I don't think is necessary for a developing country like India, where the priority has to be to increase jobs, to improve infrastructure, to create the conditions for growth. Governments have to spend, and if that spending results in a little inflation, as I said, for me 6% is okay. Maybe even 7%. I mean, I'm not being too conservative on that score. I think the worry for the government is if it goes out of control and you get to 9, 10, 11, 12%, that has a very politically and socially destabilizing effect. Because at the end of the day, inflation is, unequalizing. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Those with salary income get some protection, but not enough. And those who are on contractual jobs suffer the most. So it's a fear of inflation, which really prevents governments from, printing too much cash.
Last three questions. One is there appears to be a precipitous decline in the personal popularity of Prime Minister Modi. From last year, around this time, it was still about 70%, if I read the numbers right, and now it's ranging about 35, 36%. That's a dramatic drop. But one can argue that from this point, it can only go up, while commensurately, the poll numbers of someone like, say, Rahul Gandhi is still half of 35%. And Mamata Banerjee is just about making a blip at perhaps 2-3%. What do you think? What's your sense for 2024? Are these two at all significant rivals to Prime Minister Modi?
You see, first of all, you're right when you say that his popularity can only go up from where it is now, though it may go down a little more before it begins to go up. But it's possible that it'll go up because 3 years is a long time. And I do not rule out he's doing things in the next 2-3 years that improve his popularity.
Right.
I don't see Rahul Gandhi anywhere near challenging Prime Minister Modi. This has been my view now for more than 10 years. Mamata Banerjee has the potential, but only as part of a larger coalition. Given the situation today, my argument has been that the only way in which the non-BJP parties can take on Narendra Modi, given the money power he has, the popularity he has, the infrastructure he has, the backing of the RSS, etc., given all his advantages, the only way he can be taken on and maybe force him to have less numbers in 2024, may not even be an absolute majority, is if the regional parties have a regional strategy. That in each state you have to craft a strategy like Mamata has in Bengal. If she succeeds in ensuring that her popularity in Bengal remains high till 2024, then you can see, because if you look at the last 5 years, particularly from 2017, so 4 years, the BJP has not done well in state elections. Their performance in state elections has been quite bad. In 2 or 3 states where they lost, they regained power by buying up support. But otherwise, in terms of popular vote, they've not done well. So some kind of a coalition of regional parties can challenge him, maybe prevent the BJP from getting an absolute majority, and therefore become less belligerent and less aggressive and less arrogant than what it has been in the last 1 year. Particularly after 2019, we see a turn for the worse.
Right. In terms of as a strategy, I see Mamata Banerjee has somewhat reinvented herself by having this direct brass knuckle in your face counter to Prime Minister Modi. As they say in Hindi, loha lohe ko katta hai. Do you think that strategy will be useful for her in national on the national stage?
Yes, of course. I think that's the right strategy for her, because the thing about Prime Minister Modi, particularly what worked for him in 2019, was the image of his being a strong man. And that image helped him in 2014, and it also worked for him in 2019. But I think the narrative that is now going around is that, oh, we thought you were such a powerful politician, that you were so capable, that he would be able to handle things when they go wrong. But we find he's not able to handle the economy. We find he's not able to handle vaccination. We find he's not able to handle law and order in states like UP. So there is an increasing feeling of a man who, is not able to get things done,
Right.
and therefore an aggressive stance will certainly help Mamata Banerjee. But a formula in one part of India need not work in another part of India. You need a much more disaggregated formula. That is my view.
Right.
I think 2014 in some ways was an exception to the rule, where the entire outcome revolved around whether you wanted Rahul Gandhi as Prime Minister or Narendra Modi, and Narendra Modi won. 2019 was not such a clear verdict, though they got better numbers, but that was all because it was anti-Pakistan, anti-Muslim.
Right.
2024, what's the rabbit he will pull out of the hat? One doesn't know.
And finally, why is it that the BJP has remained a party obsessed with elections and not governance, while Congress is sort of a mirror image in reverse? It's reminiscent of somewhat the equation here in America, where Republicans seem to be perpetually campaigning, while Democrats, if I may coin a term right here, policy wonking. I see a lot of parallels between the two.
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think there are two answers to that. One is, of course, that the Congress has always had better talent. You just look at the quality of the cabinet that Manmohan Singh had and the quality of the cabinet that Narendra Modi has. And Manmohan Singh had more talent in his ministry. So Congress as a party has always had more talent. The BJP as a party has, gone forth on ideology rather than competence. And the performance of its governments in many states has not been particularly great. And the reason why they focus only on elections is it's an ideology-driven party. I mean, they believe they are on a kind of a historic mission of Hinduizing India, of restoring India back to the Hindu community. So it's a very strong ideology that drives the BJP. Congress has never been driven by such strong ideologies.
Right. On that note, I think I overshot by 2 minutes and 12 seconds. So I'll conclude there. And thank you so much for your time.